I want to touch on like a handful of supplements and a handful of medicines, drugs that perhaps people could not take. We can't advise that, but consider. And so I wanted to run through. First of all, you mentioned previously about methionine, and I've seen some studies where restriction of that possibly can extend lifespan. But if you're eating a typical like high protein diet, there's going to be elevated levels of that particular amino acid. Can you offset that with taking like TMG, glycine? Like, are there things you can do to try and mitigate that?
So what you're sort of getting at here is your methionine cycle of the body. So methionine is very important in that it creates SAM. And SAM is effectively one of our primary metal donors of the body. And so methylation and deacetylation are probably the two main things that you want to be concerned with when it comes to your genetics and your genes. So methylation effectively turns on and off genes depending on where those metal groups are attached. And then deacetylation effectively takes acetyl groups away from a histone, which is effectively like a big bunch of DNA, and makes it less accessible. So these sort of proteins are protecting your chromatin, your DNA. So when you look at the methionine cycle, TMG, trimethylglycine, or betaine as it's also known, is of itself a donor which recycles your homocysteine back to methionine. So one of the things that you can look at in your blood work if you want to see how well your methionine cycle is operating in your body is checking your homocysteine level in your blood work. And that will show you effectively how well are you recycling homocysteine back to methionine and methionine over to SAM and then SAM back to homocysteine. And at different points, there's different substrates that will leave. So the homocysteine can go off and get involved in your glutathione synthesis. It can also effectively be recycled back to methionine through your folate cycle. So this is sort of where your folate intake becomes important alongside B12, because it effectively pushes your homocysteine back to methionine in order to produce more SAM.
Okay.
And what we're starting to see is that your SAM level, and I said at the start of the podcast, your SAM sort of dictates how well mTOR is going to work. So it's one thing that we don't even consider. We all think that leucine, mTOR activation, where really there's quite a lot of things that dictate mTOR activation. So methionine and SAM is one. Glycogen levels is another one. And then obviously mechanical stress. So mechanical stress when we're doing heavy resistance training activates mTOR. So it's not just a matter of looking at, dietary restriction as the main driver of mTOR. It is probably one of the key aspects because of the availability of the nutrients, the leucine, the methionine. But there's other things that control mTOR and how mTOR creates proteins that I think from a recycling perspective, yes, you want to make sure that you have optimal folate and B12 levels in order to push that homocysteine back to methionine. But the overall availability of how methionine enters into the cycle to begin with is from dietary protein ingestion. So again, it goes back to then caloric restriction or time restricted feeding to reduce that methionine impact, as opposed to speeding up. Like TMG or betaine is more so to help push homocysteine back to methionine. Now that is an important aspect towards longevity, because homocysteine has quite a lot of negative impacts to our body, in that it can make our endothelial cells more permeable or dysfunctional. It can reduce rates of nitric oxide within our body. So homocysteine would be a marker towards cardiovascular disease. And so we do want to ensure that the levels of homocysteine are kept. I think in blood work, you want it to be less than, I think it's micrograms per liter. But the value would be somewhere between 8 to 10 on your blood work would be the ideal range for homocysteine, because we do see it correlate with cardiovascular disease. So betaine, TMG, vitamin B12, so like methylcobalamin, and tetrahydrofolate as your folate source. Those would be very important for pushing that homocysteine back to methionine to reduce, obviously, the impact that homocysteine is going to have on disease progression.
Awesome. The one other thing you keep mentioning as well is senescent cells. And so in my trying to go down the rabbit hole of senescent cells and the problems that they could possibly cause, a couple of different supplements caught my eye. So one being quercetin, the other one being fisetin. The bioavailability of both seems to be low. So I was looking at liposomal delivery systems. How effective are they in clearing out senescent cells? And if they are effective, how often would you want to do that? Is there any benefit to actually having some senescent cells in your body?
No, I don't think so the thing with senescent cells is that they don't apoptose, so they don't kill themselves, so they don't reach a point where they serve any purpose to your body. And if anything, what they effectively do is they secrete these signaling molecules, like I said, that affect all cells around them. So it's basically an anti-apoptotic pathway, what these senescent cells do.
Right.
And so like the example with gray hairs, I always laughed, like I got one gray hair in my beard and then all of a sudden I have a patch of gray hairs, and then even on the side of my head I've got a patch of gray hairs where it's like one starts and then that senescent cell starts affecting all the ones around it. And that's sort of, where people are on about reversing gray hairs. Reversing gray hairs either comes from getting the body to recognize those senescent cells that aren't making melanin anymore and removing them, or it's a copper deficiency, or you have elevated hydrogen peroxide free radicals, and that's effectively bleaching that melanin cell. So when it comes to senescence, we effectively have two ways. Either the cell has reached its Hayflick limit, so it can't divide anymore. So I guess we haven't even talked about like your telomeres, which are sort of the protective caps at the end of your DNA. I did talk about the telomere effect book, but effectively the Nobel Prize was won, I think it was in mid-2000s, where they discovered that our DNA is effectively protected. Our chromosomes that contain our genes and our DNA are effectively capped with these two very protective, protein, you could call them protein peptides, peptide chain. And every time that chromosome is accessed and we have DNA accessed and our genes accessed, the telomeres, the peptides effectively shorten. So we have small amounts of the peptides eaten away at the protective caps. And then we get to a point where the telomere has completely shortened, so that cap effectively is fully reduced, and you're left with basically a DNA strand. So now the body's seeing that this chromosome is no longer protected, and it signals off to the body that this cell can no longer effectively divide properly because the genetics inside are at compromise. So effectively it halts cellular replication, so the cell becomes senescent and the body just doesn't deal with it and lets it live. Or you have effectively the telomere is acutely shortened from chronic stress. So again, the environment, reactive oxygen species, and effectively that cell has become senescent in a very shorter amount of time compared to natural aging. But again, it's still the same pathway that senescent cell now is dysfunctional to the body. So once a cell is senescent, it's useless. So whether that is from replicative aging or whether it's from environmental insult, it basically, once one senescent cell forms, like I said, it affects the ones around it. And then over time, if a bunch of cells become senescent, especially within an organ, you're now disrupting the function of that organ. So again, if you get senescent cells in your liver and the cells, the hepatocytes around that senescent cell start again propagating, you're going to end up with patches of your liver that are completely dysfunctional. So again, you end up with potential issues towards your cholesterol, towards your bile acid synthesis, your digestion, and all these things. So it sort of snowballs. And effectively what you want your body to do is recognize there's a senescent cell, either tell it to kill itself through the activation of certain genes that are within the senescent cell. So those would be your apoptotic genes. So you want the cell to understand, okay, it's time for me to leave the body. Or you want your sort of natural killer cells of your immune system, which can seek out dysfunctional cells, which are effectively what protect us from cancer and tumor genesis, that as soon as a cell becomes dysfunctional or is sort of out of blueprint to the rest of the body, that these non-killer cells, basically natural killer cells, kill off and non-viable cells to the body. But if we can effectively then tell the body that this senescent cell serves no function, then yes, we effectively want to remove those cells from the body. So with the use of these supplements like fisetin, quercetin, resveratrol, they're really all going back to, again, that polyphenol class. And so polyphenols serve humans to a huge purpose as being, first and foremost, antioxidants and free radical scavengers. So again, the sort of buzzword of oxidative stress comes in, and that oxidative stress is basically the process whereby you have an accumulation of reactive species in higher amounts over what your body's naturally capable of producing to sequester or remove those reactive oxygen species. So these free radicals mainly would be hydrogen peroxide, superoxide, or nitric oxide. So they're all, again, reactive oxygen species. So they have an oxygen anion with a negative charge that's looking for electrons to balance itself, to effectively donate these electrons away. And so antioxidants serve the purpose of either being electron donors or electron acceptors, where they're able to stabilize the charge on hydrogen peroxide or superoxide or whatever, stabilize the charge, and so it's neutralized, so it can't react with your cells. The main part of your body that generates these reactive oxygen species are your mitochondria. So when our mitochondria, which are effectively the energy powerhouses of our cells, when they're undergoing glycolysis, fatty acid oxidation, they produce these reactive oxygen species as a byproduct to cellular metabolism. But our body then produces antioxidants like vitamin C, glutathione, catalase, there's superoxide dismutase, there's all these different antioxidants our body creates endogenously to suppress these free radicals. When our production of those free radicals, I guess those antioxidants, slows down as we age, that's when, again, diet and supplementation becomes very important, because we're effectively providing the body with a source of these antioxidants to help, I guess, shift the balance again. The oxidative stress means that you're making more free radicals than you're reducing or eliminating. So that's where, again, when we look at longevity or longitudinal studies, especially with the Mediterranean diet, where resveratrol, whether it's from wine or fruits and vegetables, plays a big role towards longevity in that sort of Mediterranean environment, because they're effectively giving their body a high intake of this antioxidant that's protecting the cells from being damaged. Because effectively, when your mitochondria makes a free radical, it doesn't discriminate. So it'll effectively start just attacking anything in its vicinity. And to be honest, attacking is probably a very harsh way of describing it. It's a byproduct that's been made by your mitochondria that doesn't know what to do other than stabilize itself. Right. And so it's going to stabilize itself by latching onto a structure that can give it that stability. And that's sort of where, again, when we generate reactive oxygen species, we can oxidize our LDL cholesterol to create oxidized LDL. And that oxidized LDL then is very unstable. And so our immune system responds and removes it and forms plaques. So we start to see why keeping oxidative stress low is very important not only to protect our cells from being damaged, but to prevent, arteriosclerosis and heart disease mainly, but also again to potentially offset if you have that oxidative stress happening within your brain. Those reactive oxygen species are going to start attacking your myelin sheath, your nerves, and so you start to see, cognitive deficits and even motor deficits start to develop because of that increase in reactive oxygen species. So there's two sort of sides to the theory of aging and the theory of longevity. At one point, they thought it was like the free radical theory of aging. So sort of like we age when we get to a point where we're making tons of these free radicals and the body's not able to keep up. But really, what was sort of proposed in the last 2 or 3 years was the mitochondrial theory of aging, in that as we get older, our mitochondria are not being supported, so we're not producing enough antioxidants, so the mitochondria are becoming dysfunctional. The mitochondria themselves are generating high levels of reactive oxygen species, which are going to damage our cells around them. But also we're going to end up with senescent cells that have mitochondria within them. So again, we want to have the process of mitophagy, which is effectively autophagy, so the removal of these dysfunctional mitochondria. And that's where we see stuff like resveratrol, fisetin, glutathione, intravenous glutathione, being a sort of big longevity supplement or sort of longevity pathway, because again, we're giving the body one of the really key antioxidants that the whole body uses to suppress free radicals. And so obviously as we age, again, our production of glutathione will slow down. That again is controlled by your dietary intake of cysteine sources. So again, it comes back to your sort of management of your dietary intake, supporting your antioxidant system in the body. And there's so many layers to this that if you did if you done caloric restriction, okay, yes, you're slowing everything down, but then you're not ingesting any of these sort of antioxidants that would be coming in through the diet. So then does that bring in a layer of, if you're doing caloric restriction, should you be taking these supplements during this sort of extended fasting period so that you're providing these antioxidants to combat what the body's doing? In my opinion, I think it is a really good strategy. If you're taking vitamin C, glutathione, curcumin, especially in the liposomal format, you're effectively enhancing the bioavailability, but you're actually delivering that ingredient inside the cells. And that was, again, coming back to formulation. That was, we were with Supplement Needs, we were one of sort of first UK supplement companies to bring liposomals into the UK market. And that was because, again, from my own research and my own longevity when I was bodybuilding, that I understood, the benefits to liposomal technology for curcumin, for resveratrol, for glutathione. And that was effectively why we formulated the liposomal range, was again to give a more accessible option to bodybuilders on higher bioavailable ingredients. Like resveratrol, bioavailability orally is about 5%. So when you're taking 100 milligrams of resveratrol, you're really seeing, max 5-10 milligrams enter systemic circulation. So at least with liposomes, the liposome protects the ingredient for delivery inside your cells before it's burst open.
And so, because time is pressing on, of course,
yeah.
Another podcast I'd love to do with you is mitochondrial dysfunction, and then perhaps we could talk about things that could support or aid mitochondrial dysfunction. So I know metformin has an impact on how mitochondria functions. Going into like NMN and NAD, like various different supplement protocols that could boost those to ultimately help would be great. So of all the questions I've still got to go, I would like to touch on a couple of things. So one being, because you mentioned it with telomeres, one way that I've really thought, I've heard many, many times, a really good description of telomeres is to think of them as like, the little caps at the end of your shoelaces, like holding your shoelaces together. Like, I think that's a really good one. But is there any way, and I'll confess that I've done this. So I've taken, and I'm going to butcher how I say any medical or drug, right? So epitalon or epithalon. I've taken that in various protocols probably consistently every year for the last 5 years, where I'll do a high dosing period for a period of like 10 to 20 days. What's your thoughts on the mechanism of how that works and whether or not it is something people should consider?
So you've touched on peptides in of themselves, depending on the peptide length, can rarely interact with your DNA. But we know that short, di, tri, and probably tetrapeptides can interact with our DNA. And so epitalon is a peptide that's made up of 4 amino acids. And it's effectively able to regulate the function of how our sort of our brain works. So how the pineal gland, and more so how our what we'd call mesenchymal stem cells. So these are sort of stem cells that are within your skeleton, or within, I guess, the liver, neurons, etc. Epitalon is able to upregulate how basically that the telomeres are being protected from the body. So it's effectively increasing the amount of the enzyme telomerase. So like we sort of discussed, your telomeres are that sort of the way you said it. It's like your shoelace. If you draw your shoelace out in a straight line, you have 2 sort of protective caps to stop the shoelace from fraying. Effectively, that's what happens when you remove the telomere off the chromosome. You're left with sort of frayed ends, and when your body sees those frayed ends, then it's time to throw the cell out. Epitalon will increase your body's expression of telomerase. So we do know that our body does have an ability to increase the telomere length. So we can start adding base pairs. We can start adding onto the peptide chain of the telomere itself to lengthen it again. It's not a very fast process, but we can do it enough that we can actually try and slow down the telomere shortening, as to speak, which effectively plays into longevity. So when you are taking epitalon as a peptide, you're effectively mimicking a peptide that already exists in the body. And that's sort of what I was trying to say at the start. It mimics a peptide that controls the functions of your brain and your effectively your stem cell proliferation. But again, it increases the amount of telomerase that you make. So as a longevity aspect, there are protocols that you'll see online where you can take a sort of blasted period of epitalon to increase the amount of telomerase, and in tandem add more base pairs back onto those telomeres that could be chronically shortened. So you are effectively buying yourself back more time on that cellular division, because again, you haven't reached the Hayflick limit. Is effectively 60 cell divisions, but that's effectively a number when the telomere has fully shortened. So you're actually extending the amount of times that cell can effectively replicate, so producing an effective cell of itself. So I guess, even in terms of like a longevity aspect, if you could forever increase the Hayflick limit of your functioning cells, you are thereby offsetting the risk of aging, so that particular organ will never fail because it's continuously generating new cells. And again, that's sort of where, not even with stem cells, but I guess oncogenic cells, if you're able to take the mechanistic approach of how a cancer cell divides and being able to apply that to your normal, naturally functioning cells, you effectively have a cell that's able to replicate indefinitely. So that's sort of where we see the dysfunction of cancer, offering some insight into our longevity, and that if we can take that forever replicative ability where it's able to produce normal proteins and normal cellular structures in tandem, you effectively live forever. So yeah, epitalon, very useful peptides, very accessible. Obviously, in terms of risks, you are introducing an exogenous peptide that is interacting directly with your DNA. Now, whether or not that can have a negative consequence, I'm completely unsure or unfamiliar, so I can't really comment there. But it does have, you do see a lot of your popular sort of biohacking influencers speak openly about epitalon as being a longevity biohack that they implement, at least once a year.
I try and, so when I've done it in the past as well, and just through, I know they're working completely different pathways and mechanisms of action, but at times of doing it, I will take growth hormone at the same time. And my logic there being that hopefully that's creating some further enhancement of telomerase's ability to repair the telomeres. That's my ridiculous thing.
I don't know the exact mechanism of epitalons. Epitalon's basically mimicking epithalamin, which is what your body makes normally. But as you can imagine, our body's ability to stop our telomeres from chronically shortening is sort of an inevitable process where we're all going to end up at that point. Sure. Again, it can fall into our body's, I guess we run into an issue where our body's not making as much epithalamin as the body's actually requiring. And so again, the cells that are producing epithalamin are slowly becoming dysfunctional of themselves as we age. But definitely, there is probably some logic to utilizing growth hormone even from a longevity aspect. But more so, I guess that the issue with growth hormone is that we do know that does reduce lifespan as an inherent factor of it being diabetogenic. So again, you're sort of causing beta cell dysfunction as a consequence of it, causing a loss of insulin sensitivity and rising blood glucose levels. So it sort of comes back to that is IGF-1 probably the more preferred method of doing what growth hormone does without having the negative consequences that growth hormone has in terms of your insulin sensitivity. Because we do know that IGF-1, when we reduce IGF-1 levels in the body, we don't see an increase in lifespan. So we know that the negative correlation is directly to growth hormone of itself, as opposed to IGF-1. But the other side is IGF-1 makes all cells proliferate. So if you do have oncogenic cells, if you have cancer cells anywhere present in your body and you have high circulating levels of IGF-1, you can be sure that those oncogenic cells are being stimulated to grow further. And again, they're starting to invade space on other cells around them that can lead to more dysfunction. So it's a really, there's a double-edged side to any of these protocols that we all personally are probably experimenting with until we have really, I guess, future proof on how everything combines as an overall mechanism.
With if you're taking growth hormone, that being one of the causes, then could you offset that by like metformin, berberine, pioglitazone?
You potentially with metformin, you do see an offset. So obviously growth hormone, very lipolytic, liberates fatty acids, lipolyzes cells. So again, opens fatty acids out of adipose cells. But as a consequence, that rise in fatty acids can cause other organs then to become dysfunctional. So you start to see obviously a buildup of fatty acids potentially affecting the pancreas. And so we start to see oxidative stress develop in the pancreas. Metformin then effectively acts on the liver to make us more sensitive to insulin, helps, I guess, preserve the liver's sensitivity to glucose, but also has a secondary aspect in that it does change levels at the gut. So we start to see expression of particular bacteria within our gut that effectively lowers oxidative stress, lowers our ability for elevated blood glucose levels, and effectively the decrease in blood glucose levels is what causes the tandem reduction in oxidative stress. So metformin alongside growth hormone, would be a useful way to target one aspect of that diabetogenicity. So you're raising your diabetic risk, but probably more so. Go for it.
And I was saying, presumably, like with rising levels of cholesterol with the fatty acid oxidation, like you'd have to throw statin in there as well. Perhaps.
Yeah, so you end up, you do see. Now, this hasn't happened in any sort of human model that I've seen, but definitely in rats where they've chronically given growth hormone, you start to induce diabetes because of there's this high influx of fatty acids, I guess, fluxing into the liver and the pancreas itself and creating dysfunction. And so, you start to see, again, like what we talked about earlier, with the liver, if your then gallbladder is not producing enough bile, or you're not effectively helping that bile flow through the bile ducts, causing cholestasis, you're affecting the liver then. And then the liver is playing off to your sort of glucose metabolism of itself and your fatty acid metabolism as well. And so there's just a knock-on effect that even with like growth hormone as a longevity tool, there are risks to it, that it's probably more so one of these interventions that you'd do on a periodic basis. So it wouldn't be something that you'd want to be taking like chronically elevated every single day.
Sure.
And that's probably more so where my opinion with even growth hormone use from a longevity perspective, even mirrored to bodybuilding and a muscle building discussion, would be to use it on potentially training days only and using it before bed. So you're effectively mimicking or I guess aiding your body's own endogenous production of growth hormone during deep sleep. And then because growth hormone takes about 4 hours to peak following an injection, you're getting that secondary peak of growth hormone in the later half of your sleep period. And then the sort of exogenous injection level is back to your sort of normal baseline after 12 hours. So that sort of sleep period, you've got your deep sleep, circadian production of growth hormone from the pineal gland, and then you've got effectively the injection starting to peak 4 hours into sleep. So you've got sort of two peaks that you're riding on, and using it on training days, you're effectively helping the body to recover during that sleep period following training, when you want IGF-1 picking up while the body's trying to repair itself during sleep. And then you're not using it to the extent that you're going to cause chronically elevated blood glucose levels from taking it every single day. And you're not upsetting your body's own, somatostatin cycles, so that you're not suppressing your body's ability to produce growth hormone during the day in response to meals or in response to training or in response to elevations in insulin. But you are selectively helping raise that level during sleep for your overall recovery, which of itself plays into muscle building and longevity.
And with that in mind, would you, by taking it just on particular days of the week, does that have any effect on the days you don't take it? So would I still have the same growth hormone output the following night if I didn't take it naturally, or would that be suppressed to offset the fact that I had more the day before? And presumably we're talking about not super physiological levels. We're talking about like a replacement, like 1 IU or something like that.
So dose-wise, I'd still be aiming towards, like, on average, an average male, growth hormone is prescribed on like a milligram per kilogram basis. But if we take that approach, on average, 70 to 80 kilo male makes about 3 to 4 IUs of growth hormone per night. So if we err on the side of caution, 3 IUs being sort of the lowest, if we implement 3 IUs before bed in sort of a replacement dose perspective, you're not interfering to the same extent as if you were doing, 1 IU multiple times per day or 2 IUs multiple times per day. Because effectively, as soon as our growth hormone level within our blood plasma rises, you have a negative feedback mechanism, which is somatostatin, which effectively says, right, stop secreting the pituitary, stop secreting growth hormone. Right. So if if you take it on your training days only, effectively because of the 12 hours sort of washout then with the half-life, you take it before bed, it peaks 4 hours into sleep, and by the time you wake up the next morning, it's sort of cleared from the system. You're back to your normal somatostatin cycle of producing growth hormone and somatostatin in sort of feedback to it. And again, how we produce that from the pituitary in response to meals and insulin. So you're not really going to have a huge effect on say you took growth hormone on a training day on a Monday, and then Tuesday was a rest day, so that night you didn't take it. You're not sort of feeding on to Tuesday night. You should be back to your normal circadian production from your own pituitary gland. And you're sort of, this is where the multiple dosing of growth hormone, even sort of protocols where people are using, 2 IUs of growth hormone every, 6 hours up to bedtime, is really having a detrimental effect on their own natural production. Now, they probably understand this, and then they're accepting that their own natural production of growth hormone is going to be blunted. Mm-hmm. But if you are effectively putting exogenous growth hormone into the system every few hours, you're going to see a peak in somatostatin. And so you want to even understand, if you're doing 2 IUs in the morning, 2 IUs before training, and 2 IUs before bed, that the 2 IUs from the morning time is going to peak 4 or 5 hours after the injection if you're doing a sub-Q. It can be a little bit quicker with intramuscular. But once that peak plasma level is achieved from the growth hormone, you're effectively producing your peak somatostatin level so that the brain can't produce anymore. So you're then relying on, a few hours later, you're doing your next 2 IUs to pick plasma levels of GH up again. So it's again, it's like double-edged. You're using something to elevate your growth hormone levels throughout the day that potentially you could be doing anyway naturally. But the other side of it is that growth hormone accounts for 70 to 80% of your IGF-1 production from your liver. So having elevated growth hormone levels throughout the day where you're putting 2 IUs in continuously is going to yield higher IGF-1, which, again, the context of recovery is going to help with cellular rebuilding processes and obviously helping strengthening tissues that might be damaged from training. So you're also then increasing, obviously you're decreasing your longevity because you're increasing the amount of growth hormone that's present in the body, which again brings that diabetogenic risk also with it. So, all these strategies, there's pros and cons that you start to see that. Again, it comes down to the person accepting the risk and what they're willing to do with these strategies.
With that level of growth hormone as well, if you're doing it in that protocol you kind of described, would you potentially see any downregulation in your body's ability to convert T4 to T3 or any thyroid disruption? Or do you think that at that level it would be fine?
It's very hard to say, but we do know that GH plays into the thyroid axis and that it increases the conversion of T4 to T3. Now, whether or not that will present as, I wouldn't even say subclinical hypothyroidism, it could lead into lower levels of T4 within the body. But again, your T4 pool is a direct correlation almost of what you're ingesting in terms of your diet. So we're going back then to iodine, selenium, and some other sort of trace metals in ensuring that you are able to maintain T4 synthesis within the thyroid itself. So the increased turnover of thyroid hormone definitely is one of the sort of metabolic consequences of elevated growth hormone. So you do start to see obviously improved metabolism because you have higher levels of free T3 hormone. And it's sort of, again, where we see not a level of bro science, but you often see guys saying, if you're going to use growth hormone chronically and in sort of super physiological dosing regimens that we see in bodybuilding, that you should be taking thyroxine alongside it. And that sort of stems from this published research on that effect on increased T3 conversion. But if we don't see any detriment to T4 synthesis, and that's all controlled by nutrition. And then the T4 really can be thyrotoxic. We can put too much T4 into the body. And again, we're making more T4 accessible for T3 turnover again, which has other implications when we're hyperthyroid. So it's definitely an interesting compound from a longevity and a muscle building perspective. And we do know, obviously, then from the muscle building side of things, that the improvement we see in skeletal muscle mass significantly improves when we combine anabolic steroids with growth hormone versus growth hormone by itself. So there is obviously, again, a synergism to that nitrogen retention being able to play into IGF-1 receptor activation to cause more protein proliferation, protein synthesis. But yeah, it's one of those ones that you're playing with a double-edged sword again with the GH and IGF-1.
So I think we answered probably 2% of the questions I had. So the other podcasts, off the top of my head, I've got mitochondrial dysfunction. I've got everything to do with the brain, and going into that, also fasting mimetics, exercise mimetics, other pharmacology things we could do to perhaps support a bodybuilding lifestyle. And so I need to book you up for the next month. But in the meantime, if anyone wants to get hold of you, what's the best way for them to contact you? And also, do you have a code for supplement needs as well? Because we'll put that in the description.
Yeah. So probably the easiest way is to just follow me on Instagram. That's where I tend to put all my energy to. So my Instagram is DeanSTM, DeanSTM. And now we have the supplement needs Instagram, which is @supplement_needs. The website's supplementneeds.co.uk, and my discount code is Dr. Dean, and that will get you 10% off the entire website.
Awesome. I use someone else's. I'm going to use yours from now. so you go. I know so many people like in the US and here in Dubai that get supplement needs. Probably the most popular one is the CV stack. Like I've been using that for, I don't know, as long as I can remember.
And that again comes back to the sort of short discussion, or even extending the podcast any further. But that is basically a really rich polyphenol and antioxidant supplement. It has the classical stuff like citrus bergamot that people are familiar with helping their HDL. But my old crux to cardiovascular disease risk reduction is through, that lowering reactive oxygen species, protecting your LDL from being damaged. Same way, protecting ourselves from aging, we're protecting against those free radicals. So the heart stack, CV stack is probably my favorite of them all. Someone asked me recently, like, name my 3 supplements if I could only take 3. And it was basically multivitamin, Mineral Pro, our chewable Omega Pro, and CV stack. And it was basically, you had all your micronutrients covered with one. You've got, an abundance of omega-3s if you're able to take as many of the omega pros as you like. And then CV stack playing into the polyphenols, vitamin E. You've got this huge powerhouse supplement that is effectively giving your body these antioxidants to protect you against aging. So I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dean. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to where we can catch up again.
Thanks a million, Mark.